Hello, welcome to another episode of the Data Science Leaders Podcast. I am your host, Dave Cole, and today's guest is Kaushik Raha. Kaushik is the VP of Data Science at Elsevier. So Kaushik, first of all, welcome to the Data Science Leaders Podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you, Dave. Thanks for the invitation.
Great. So you're the VP of Data Science at Elsevier. You've been there for, 3 years or so. You have 15 plus years of data science experience in the pharmaceutical and healthcare area. You also have a PhD in computational chemistry, but let's start with Elsevier. What is Elsevier? I'm not familiar with it personally.
Yeah, sure. So Elsevier it's a global publishing company. So, we started out as a publishing company, but at this time, Elsevier is transforming into, an information and analytics company. So we have our roots in publishing, where we have published, very well-known books and journals. I'll give you an example. Lancet, for example, is an Elsevier journal.
Of course.
And so is the Cell, right? So Dr. Fauci held up like a paper from Lancet, as you remember. And now we are sort of transforming into an information analytics company. We want to take our content, extract the data, and we want to sort of generate the insights from that data. And we serve many different sectors. So there's the research sector, but more importantly, there's also life sciences and the pharmaceutical sector. So what I'm right now in charge of is data science within the healthcare sector for Elsevier. So yeah.
Perfect. Well, that brings us right to our agenda, because the first topic we're going to dive into is data science and healthcare. I have spoken with other leaders, DSLs within the healthcare industry, but because you sort of service the broader healthcare industry, it'll be nice to get your lens on just the state of healthcare and how data science plays a role there. Also, we're going to be diving into, a topic that is near and dear to your heart, which is bias in data science. That comes up from time to time, but we're going to really dive deep into it in this episode. And then last but not least, another one, a recurring theme, operationalizing data science. So we'll also be talking about operationalizing data science and just getting your thoughts on that too. So great. So let's first start off with data science and healthcare. So how do you see data science? I mean, first of all, Elsevier, you mentioned, is sort of transforming into an information analytics type company. So in sort of being a sort of a pure play publishing company, can you talk a little bit about that transformation effort?
Yeah, sure. So like I said, we have our roots in publishing, but now what we want to do is, take the content that we own as a publisher and essentially drive outcomes and drive decisions. And these could be decisions in research. It could be decisions in healthcare. So what we want to do is essentially do decision support, leveraging our content, extracting the data, and extracting the insights from that data and driving outcomes with those insights. So all of this, the underpinning is data science and artificial intelligence in the future and even now. And the reason for that is we can only be successful in this if we are able to leverage sort of data science and AI technology. So we have a lot of content, and then we want to sort of extract the data from the content and not just use that data, but also marry it up with other data sets. For example, in healthcare, you can think of patient data or electronic health records and medical records. So how can we sort of combine these different silos of data sets and essentially support decision making in the clinic or in scientific research? And the only way you can do this is by leveraging data science at this point. So.
Right. So Elsevier, I imagine, has lots of content. Obviously, it's been traditionally been a publisher. So a lot of the analytics that you're doing is probably NLP type use cases, I imagine. Is that right? Yep. And then you said marrying that up with patient data, electronic health records. That is probably not data that you have. Is that data that your customers have and bring to the table, and you help sort of marry the two?
Yeah, exactly. So that's the data that our customers have, and we have products where we sort of interface with the customer, and they bring that data to us, and sort of we bring in our expertise in content and our expertise in the data products that are coming out of content. And I'll give you an example. One of our products is Clinical Path, which is essentially a decision support tool for oncologists who are caring for cancer patients. And what it does, it tells or it gives the pathway for treatment for cancer patients to the oncologists. And what we do is we record, whether they have been on pathway or they're going off pathway, and we basically give them the pathway for treatment, also the rationale for that, which is supported by the evidence that we have extracted from our content. But what we also get in return is, so the patient journey, viewpoint from the provider,
Right.
from the cancer centers and whatnot. And essentially, that's where we want to do the analytics for making the product better, so that how can we, make sort of this pathway even more effective or robust and leading to the best outcome. So we want to sort of capture the patient journey, the end of the journey with the outcome, and connect it back to sort of the data that we're getting out of our content. So
Right. So you're getting some of the real world data from your customers,
Yep.
but the sort of, you mentioned the pathway to treatment data comes from much of the published work that Elsevier has collected over the years in terms of like this is the typical pathway to treatment for a specific type of cancer. For
it's a little more than that. So it's in addition to that, there is a group of sort of experts who synthesize these pathways, and we enable that as well by providing the evidence for so it's not just a data product that is automatic. There's a lot of oversight, because we are talking about maybe life and death decisions here, so we want to get it right. So enabling creation of these pathways is where we do the data science, where we are sort of extracting the content or curating the content, getting the evidence from there, and also marrying it up with the patient data or with the other sort of data sets that we get from not just the providers, but we also have social data. So we want to also tie it up with social determinants of health. And Elsevier's parent company, Relics, actually has a lot of that data as well. So that's where sort of me and my team, we operate in the intersection of these different areas. So
Right. So I mean, what you're actually doing is you're providing a service, right? And you're like, well, you're creating a product, I assume, essentially for the various customers that you have. And most of your customers, are they're in the healthcare industry, so they're healthcare companies as well. Okay, and you're nodding your head. So
healthcare providers. We just to make a distinction, we don't do much with payers. It's not insurance companies, but we do have the leverage there to get in there. But also, pharmaceutical companies and life science companies who are developing drugs and medicines, and they want to understand. They want to understand the clinical trial space. Where can we bring in? Where can they plug in the clinical trials that they might be running based on our data products and the services that we offer? So it is sort of that that spectrum of customers, starting from providers, maybe also pharma companies and life science companies who are trying to develop medicines. So.
Got it. So let's go back to the original question. Just from your catbird seat in working with various customers, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges facing the sort of the healthcare industry today, and what role do you see data science playing?
Yeah, so I think I'll frame this question in two parts. One would be sort of the pre-COVID, and one is the post-COVID world, right? So even before COVID, healthcare industry was facing challenges, and COVID's brought about its own set of challenges. So at least from my vantage point, I think there are like 4 or 5 main challenges. One of them is sort of the burden of medical errors. So in today's day, there's a lot of diagnostic and therapeutic errors which lead to these adverse events, and there's a statistic there which is kind of numbing actually. In a recent study, every year around 43 million patients are injured due to these adverse events, and that's avoidable. So that's like a huge burden.
What is an adverse event?
An adverse event is something that has happened as a result of mistake in a diagnosis or or a therapy. For example, there was a misdiagnosis, or there was a wrong medication that was prescribed, or a wrong procedure that was done. So that's an adverse event, and that leads to patient injury, and that is absolutely avoidable. So these statistics are pretty mind-numbing. So I think that's a big burden for healthcare, a challenge for healthcare. The other one I would say is the data explosion that we are sort of seeing right now in the healthcare data explosion, and healthcare data is increasing sort of faster than any other industry, and the projected growth is almost like 36% compound annual growth rate through 2025. So this is definitely big data, but I think the problem with healthcare in general is that it's fragmented and it's siloed. So you have many
Right.
health systems, many payer provider systems who have their own, data silos, and there's no ways to connect them or at least connect them easily. So I think that makes wholesome sort of insight generation or decision support quite challenging. So that's the one big challenge. The third one I would think is the information explosion, and from my point of view, it's like the explosion of the scientific literature and how it's not being converted to clinical practice soon enough. So again, some statistics there. Just 14% of scientific discoveries actually make into daily practice, and this presents a unique challenge because we are talking about like evidence-based medicine or evidence-based care, but we are sort of falling so far behind in getting the real evidence out in clinical practice. So that's kind of a big challenge. And finally, I think the model of healthcare delivery has changed, right? So it has gone to value-based care from like a fee-for-service model. So that presents its own challenges. So healthcare providers are being asked to do more with less, and they're saying they're being asked to spend the least amount of money but improve patient outcomes. So given all of the above, I mean, I think that becomes even more of a challenge. So that's sort of even healthcare challenges in general. But I would say post-COVID, we are faced with a whole set of challenges, right? So there's digital transformation, there's telehealth, there's how do you manage supply chains for manufacturing drugs or vaccines and whatnot. And there's definitely more considerations around privacy and personal health information and cybersecurity. So I think all of it makes it quite a mix right now in the post-COVID world. And so coming to your second question about data science, I think it plays a important role and will continue to play an important role. And in fact, at least I might be biased, but I can't think of any other sort of tools that's out there which we can use for managing and organizing and generating insights, except for data science and AI. Just because the volumes explosion, the data deluge that we have right now, I think data science has a role to play. And I also think that it'll be playing a role in digital transformation all across the globe, which will hopefully make healthcare delivery sort of more equitable. Right now, we have that big problem that it's not equitable, and some places or some people actually are getting the best, whereas others are left behind. So I do believe that data science will play a role in all of these.
Okay, wow. I just got bombarded with a lot. We just got bombarded with a lot of great information from you. So first, I have a few questions. I've just taken some notes along the way here, Kaushik.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned the data explosion. So there's like 36% more data year over year, like today and this year versus last year. So what do you know? What is causing that explosion? Why is there more data today than there was even a year ago?
Yeah, so it's a combination of many factors. Again, the digitization is causing it, right? So everything is becoming digital, right? So there's patient records are now digital. Every X-rays, everything that you can think of is basically going into a database somewhere. So
Right.
that's one aspect, and then we have biosensors and the Internet of Things and like. Healthcare within your home, where there's this continuous sort of deluge of things that are measuring things and putting it somewhere in a database, and it's happening at the individual level, right? So you can imagine what that does. Like the exponential effect is tremendous. And again, I'll come back to like scientific research. Even that is growing leaps and bounds. So when you combine all of this, you can see how it's that number that we're getting to, and it's probably going to increase in the future. So.
I'll give you a personal example, Kaushik. I coincidentally had my checkup yesterday, and doctors, for whatever reason, medical profession just they tend to be fairly old school. The paper based, like getting them off of paper and getting them to start capturing things electronically. I don't understand why. Some people have to explain to me why that is. They tend to push back. I think it's mainly because of speed, right? The typing stuff in is more painful than just quickly writing it down. But I walked in and I looked behind the front desk, and there was a wall of I believe medical records in files, like just sitting on walls and walls and a wall of paper. And then I sat down, and during my checkup, I have a great doctor. He's fantastic, but he's asking me a lot of these questions that I'd answered years ago, right? Like, do you have any history of heart disease in your family, a history of cancer, all this stuff? And I was thinking to myself, I've already answered these questions, but I saw him typing it in, right? He was typing all these things into one of these systems. I won't name names, but like And I was just thinking to myself, okay, he's now transforming. He's getting off of the paper-based. And I mean, of course, I would like for him to have gone through the paper and typed it in ahead of time and just confirmed a lot of these things, but he was just typing it in for the first time. At any rate, so I think there's a lot of that just going on, right? And I think that's what you mentioned is the digitization, like the providers becoming more sort of moving into the digital era, which I think for many of our listeners who are not in the healthcare industry might be scratching their head, right? Because so many, retail, everyone's gone, this is sort of old school.
And to be honest, like I think the regulatory aspects around healthcare data and the privacy and data security has slowed things down, and for a good reason, right? So so I mean, it's not like Target or Walmart where you're going to buy your diapers or whatnot, right? This is no one knows about your healthcare history, so. The approach's been you might as well be safe than sorry, and I don't want to be sued down the road for a data breach or something like that, right? So you do understand it, but it's also becoming something that is unsurmountable. I mean, it's becoming a huge issue right now because you still see doctors doing this, or even nurses like taking down these notes. At the same time, they're asked to put these enter these into like healthcare records, right? And do that work themselves, and that's actually physician burden or nurse burden, which needs to be relieved. And that's where again sort of data science and AI come in a big way, because it would be really great if it was sort of seamless, right? When the doctor is talking to you, there's a digital assistant which is doing that work of recording that and putting that into making sure that its quality assurance is there, and the health the privacy aspects are maintained, and all that kind of stuff, and then it gets entered into a digital database. There are a few checks and balances there for sure, but then how cool would that be that even if the doctor is sort of asking these, they are not the ones who have to go and enter this, which is where we are right now. So I think that's where the opportunity where we can do a lot and avoid physicians.
Yeah, I smell a product there, Kaushik, right? Like a speech to text, and then answers to these questions, making their way into like some structured data set.
There are products there. There are like dictation software that's out there, but actually Elsevier is also partnering with some companies where we do go a step further, and we kind of can also provide suggestion for diagnosis or tie it up with patient history, and so it's sort of a clinical advice type platform that we are building. So I mean, there's a lot going on there, and it's an exciting area actually. So.
I mean, this is a transformation that is a long time coming, and I'm glad to see it happen. I'm glad to see that you're helping to make that happen. One last thing that the statistic that you threw out there: 14% of scientific sort of discoveries actually make their way into general practice. Like, why do you? I mean, first of all, that's terrifying, right? To think that me as a patient, if there's some like discovery that's already happened and my doctor's not aware of it and it's not part of like their standard practice, that's very, very scary. So what do you think the cause of that is?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the burden of keeping yourself informed and abreast, right? So a doctor, I mean, how much do you expect a doctor to do? And like another statistics, not to throw out statistics here, but apparently it will take 21 hours for a doctor on average to stay abreast of the literature on a daily basis.
Yeah.
So I mean, and think about that number, right? How are you going to do anything else? So that's one thing, and I think the other aspect here is that and you mentioned this. Doctors are set in their ways. They have done their clinical practice. They believe the experience is all that matters. They've seen enough patients, and they don't need to know anything else. I mean, to put it in rough terms. But to be honest, that's an issue. So there is inertia there, right? So I mean, I know this works, and why should I go and read a paper or try and find out? So that's also something that we're trying to bridge that gap, is to, again, extract the evidence and present it in a very contextual manner to the physician or the clinician when they're actually seeing patients. So how can you get that latest scientific research, to the clinical practice is something that we're working on.
Data science absolutely can help there, and ideally in a concise way as well, like helping to curate and make their life a lot easier in a contextual way. That makes total sense. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit, and I want to move on to our next agenda topic, which is talking about bias in data science. So we mentioned that in sort of the post-COVID era, security, sort of privacy concerns are all important. Bias has always historically been been something that data scientists need to think through, and certainly in healthcare related use cases as well. So talk to us a little bit about how you see bias playing a pivotal role, or how you've addressed bias, just personally within your own team.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I would say that first of all, let's just define what bias is, right? So I mean, recently I saw a really great essay by Daniel Kahneman, who's the Nobel laureate, who defines bias as predictable errors that cloud your judgment and take it in a different direction. So basically an average of errors is bias, and if there's directionality, if there's bias, if there's no directionality, there's noise, right? So bias is important to address, and especially in healthcare, and especially in my field, because it has a network effect, right? So like what we put out there is used by clinicians, it's used by students who are learning to be doctors or nurses. So if bias exists in those products, it is kind of really insidious and can end up doing a lot of harm. So we have to be very careful that our products don't have the bias. So how do we address bias? Is it's a hard problem. So the one thing that we want to do is make sure that the bias is not there in our content in the first place, right? So because our data products are essentially derived from our content. So if there's bias in our content, then that's something that we need to take out. And bias comes in different forms. There's explicit bias and there's implicit bias. And implicit bias is sort of harder to uncover, to correct for. And explicit bias is somewhat easier. So that's where
define that for, if you don't mind. Just what is explicit versus implicit bias?
So
define that for our
I
audience.
suppose explicit bias would be something where you're using explicit categories or terms in your description of a thing or a decision that you're making. And in the context of criminal justice system, I can give you many examples, right, of explicit bias where you're targeting an ethnicity or a race and saying that and your decision has that very explicitly in there, right? And that's explicit bias. And implicit bias is where it's not that's not defined clearly, but there's still bias, and it's in the way something's being said without actually sort of mentioning categories or ethnicities and so on and so forth. So that's kind of what you have to be aware of. It's just the way, or the way a study's been designed. You want to do some research. You've designed the study that is biased in nature, right? So the outcomes are going to be biased, and perhaps you are biased, and that's why you are sort of doing that study, right? So those are the implicit bias, examples that we have to be aware of. So in our case, like I said, we have to be very sure that bias is not in our content, both in explicit and implicit form. And this could be, questions that we are, question banks that we are selling to educators for training physicians or nurses, or case studies that are used for clinical decision support. And so we literally comb through our content and try to find bias in a retrospective manner, as well as build these tools that can do this in perspective manner, right? So
by comb through, are you saying that your team, your data scientists, are actually looking through, trying to identify maybe a bias in questions and using that and trying to flag that in your models in some way?
In existing content, yeah. So flag that and make sure that the content, the content that is being used for the modeling purpose doesn't have that bias. I'll give you an example. Like I mentioned, explicit bias. We can do sort of a keyword search type strategy, which is much more simpler, and then identify where explicit bias might be, and then we have sort of a phase where SMEs and subject matter experts will look into that and look for whether there's real bias or not, or whether there's implicit bias or not, and then we kind of create these goal sets or validation sets. Then we can build the ML algorithms of those data sets. So that's kind of how it works. But I will tell you that it's actually a very challenging task and needs a lot of sort of SME support or input, subject matter expertise to look into that. Because not only is there bias here, there's another dimension of subject matter itself, which is very complicated. This is medicine, this is surgery, or nursing. These are not easy. These are highly specialized topics, right? So you're sort of looking into dimensions here for bias in highly specialized fields. And again, the other one would be how to address representation from different groups. And again, I mentioned that. So that the balancing of the data sets that are used for model building is very important. So yeah, we have to do this actively, and that's how we kind of address bias in my team.
So I'm trying to summarize a bit here. So you have explicit bias, right, where that would be using, I don't know, gender or age or ethnicity, like explicitly in your models, and trying to sort of root that out and prevent that from being part of your model. And then there's implicit bias where it could be a result of just the way that in which the data was collected, where maybe it wasn't intentional, but it just happened to have, I don't know, it happened to have a skew in in some of those demographic categories in some way or another.
Yep.
Where do you? There's also, just in my experience, there's also sort of proxy. You have to be aware of sort of proxies for certain things. So it might not be explicit, right? So for example, a particular zip code might have a certain age or gender, or even probably not gender, but like certainly have a certain ethnic sort of makeup. Like how do you root out some of those sort of proxy type bias, that bias by proxy? Like is that is a form of explicit, or do you consider that implicit? Like where does that fall?
I would
how do you
put
root
that
out?
into the implicit bias category, where there's a proxy, and those are again sort of hard to root out, and that's where we look for like knowledge of the domain and knowledge of what the proxy actually means. And again, in the context of medicine or health, that is even more complex, right? Because it's not just not just a demographic data, but there's also sort of a healthcare component in there. And so we do have like social determinant SDOH data, which helps us with those kind of investigations. And so we can kind of do an SDOH analysis on its own and see what sort of biases are there in the social data to begin with. And then when you're using that for model building, combining it with healthcare data, you can kind of get an idea of what those proxies might be and correct for those, or at least account for those in your models, right? So
right. And then the second thing I heard you say is, especially the world of healthcare, when you're dealing with, very technical papers where, they're written by PhDs and doctors and that sort of thing. Like as a data scientist, members of your team, you can't be expected to understand all the ins and outs of all the various papers. So really bringing an SME, right, who can help with that. And are these SMEs, are they folks that have sort of been trained in the basics of what to look for when it comes to bias, or they just or does your team just sort of bring them in just for their specific expertise in that?
It's the latter actually. So they have the specific expertise in medicine. So most of the, I'll talk about my team. So my team has not just data scientists, but we also have subject matter experts. And actually, at one point, we had more subject matter experts than data scientists. And
really, wow.
Yeah, and now it's I guess it's like 50-50 or a little bit skewed. But yeah, I mean, so the SMEs.
I'm curious, what is their title? Like, what is their title? Like,
they're mostly like MDs or MD PhDs.
Right, but what is their role? I guess on your team. It's not like Bob the SME. Like,
right,
what is?
I'm
curious.
Right, sure.
Yeah.
The title is clinical analytics specialist or knowledge representation specialists. So yeah, so those are the titles.
And they get paired up with like a data scientist, sort of, for various projects.
Absolutely. I mean, I actually always want SMEs to be in the project, even if there is a very little SME component, because, again, talking about biases and keeping them grounded, keeping the data scientists like, near to the subject matter is really important when they're model building. So yeah, I mean, my teams are always comprised of, SMEs and data scientists. And the reason is because we get into creation of goal sets where, the SME knowledge is important, and we kind of pair them up with data scientists for that purpose. So it's the whole idea of sort of active learning, where your machine learning model is giving you an output, and then you're using that to improve your validation set, or your test set, or your goal set for that matter. So that's kind of driven by the combination of these skill sets. So I forget what the question that you had asked was. Something else though. Like, what was the question that you had asked?
Oh, sorry. The question that I asked was whether or not these sort of specialists have expertise in bias, or they just like have expertise in medicine alone, right?
Yeah, and the short answer to that is they have expertise in medicine, and but I mean, they do understand bias. I mean, they the thing about doctors and people who have been who see patients is they have been in the real world, and they kind of have, they're people facing, these are people facing jobs, right? So it's not like they're siloed and sitting in a lab somewhere doing their own experiment. So they do understand the dynamics of bias and how it works in the real world. So,
yeah, I mean, they almost play your customer role in a sense. I mean, they're looking over the results and they're like, okay, is a doctor actually going to going to use this?
Exactly.
Is a provider actually going to use this, right? So I think that's a very, very valuable role, because you may not, given that Elsevier is providing, creating products for the various providers out there, you may not have them easily accessible, right? It's not like you're a healthcare company yourself and have access to them. So I probably should have started with this question, Kaushik. I was sort of wrap up with probably the most important question here around bias in data science, which is like, why does it matter? Why is it so important for your team to like root out bias in data science? And I know that's a kind of a weird question, but I think it's sort of fundamental.
Because it's a matter of life and death, very simply, right? So if you say that you're doing clinical decision support where you're giving a physician a direction to go in terms of treatment or diagnosis or procedure or whatnot, and you have bias in those models, I mean, the outcome can be really bad, and even if it leads to a minor injury, I mean, is that acceptable? So, that's,
I mean, to be blunt, the outcome could be wrong, right? The data set that you could be using, because it had, it's inherently biased, or the model that you build because it's inherent bias, might be providing the wrong recommendation.
Yeah, it might
right?
be the wrong recommendation.
Yeah.
So we have to be.
That's
one of the biggest reasons. But also, there is categorizations of the products that we have, and we are not going into purely into sort of decision support in the sense that then it becomes from FDA standpoint it becomes a different product, right? So we are more in the business of recommendations and clinical advice, if you will. But again, the point still remains that if you are giving wrong advice, then it can lead to essentially it's a matter of life and death. And one more point that I'll make is that as we are building these products, we kind of see this inflection where the doctors, the clinicians go from sort of not accepting an AI or an ML based product to completely being dependent on that, right? So to the point that they sort of trust it with everything that they that they have, and that's even more dangerous because at this point you have their trust, but then you have the bias, which is gonna be really bad.
Yeah, I mean, most of the times we talk about on the DSL podcast, we talk about how do we get sort of the business users, in this case, it could be the medical profession, to sort of buy in and adopt, right? But what happens with it's interesting you're pointing out what happens at the extreme where they've already bought in, hook, line, and sinker, and they almost trust it over potentially their own instincts. And then suddenly you can't be wrong, right? Which brings into, there's how you should actually use those recommendations and making sure that they, are always balanced with some, sort of, I imagine you want it balanced with some of that real world expertise and experience, right?
Yeah. And I do want to highlight this point because I think, we talk about bias and we always think of, how do you get the buy-in and make sure that, your customers have buy-in and bias, how does that play in there? But I think your listeners and everybody else who's practicing data science should be very cognizant of the fact that there's the other extreme where people are essentially just depending on, on what the algorithm is providing as, as a decision or something.
Right.
And that's even more dangerous, actually. So we definitely need to make sure that we get it right.
Perfect. Well, so speaking of which, this is a great segue into our last agenda topic, right? Which is to talk about operationalizing data science. So what is there any sort of tips and tricks that you have for our audience in terms of sort of best practices and because you've been creating these analytic products for a few years here now, what sort of advice do you have?
Yeah, so I think one of the key insights that I want to share is, really understand what your customer needs are and figure out what exactly is it that you want, that you have to operationalize. So, I mean, is it data ops or is it ML ops or AI ops? And, by that, what I mean is all these things are different, right? There's a different burden and there's a different expectation of that operationalization will carry when it comes to any of this. So, for example, I would say that data ops is probably much less challenging, and things can happen asynchronously, right? So your modeling or data science team can be building their models, and your product essentially is a derived data, which is less of a burden to operationalize. But then on the other extreme is ML models that need to be sort of live and that consistently have to perform and have to have really low latency because the prediction in real time is what the product is or what is being used. So there, the burden of operationalization is a lot higher. And I mean, for that, we have best practices like continuous integration, continuous deployment, CI/CD, which we sort of use pretty regularly and heavily in Elsevier. Essentially, what we do is make sure that the data science and the engineering teams are working really closely, and there's this continuous dialogue, and everything that's being developed is deployed and tested, and it's an iterative process. So yeah, I mean, for this, there needs to be a very good understanding of what this CI/CD pipeline looks like, not just by the data scientists, but also by the engineers and the architects, and everybody else has to be on the same page, and very sort of clear definition of roles and responsibilities. One of the things I've noticed is, due to the commoditization of data science, like a lot of times, like engineers will start doing data science, and the whole CI/CD pipeline breaks down at that point. So like as a leader, I think you have to be, you have to draw the lines and say, this is the pipeline, do we agree on this or not? And then sort of stick to that. I think the other thing I would say is that, really think hard about what does success look like from an operationalization standpoint, and make sure that you have some metrics which are very general. So like, what would be the best outcome for this operationalization initiative or this production initiative? And then sort of record that over a period of time so you can compare it across, different operationalization initiatives and operational approach. So that you're moving the needle, or it's in a very data-driven manner. You're improving your best practices or your what you do as part of operationalizing your model. So yeah, I think those are some of the key insights that I have for people who are doing this, and deploying ML models. And so on.
Got it. So you mentioned that making sure that the clear roles are defined and that the engineers are not actually doing data science. You actually have engineers who are like, I'm going to retrain this model. I know what I'm doing. Like, I don't need to bother the data scientists. You actually, that's actually happening.
It can happen. So sometimes it does happen. So, so, yeah, I mean, not.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about you, but that's almost, that's obviously a bad thing. You don't want to have that happen, but who knows? Maybe that's a future data scientist on your hands, or definitely a future ML.
Yeah, that's engineer. I call that a career track. So,
right.
So, but on the other hand, I'm not sort of. It's not the worst thing ever. I'm just saying that there has to be communication when this is happening. So if an engineer is retraining the models, and maybe it's perfectly fine to do so, right? I mean, so as long as the data scientists and the engineers have a good understanding that, yeah, this part of this, CI/CD process, yeah, maybe you can retrain the models when we supply with the new data, or
with the new set data,
yeah. So yeah, I mean, just so that everybody is in sort of consensus about that, So
yeah, I mean, you started off saying like that one of the most important aspects of productionalizing your models is that tight partnership with the engineering team, and then in some DSLs I talk to, they actually have ML engineers on their team who are responsible. It sounds like in your situation, they're probably part of another team, maybe part of the IT org or what have you.
Right.
Obviously both models are all exist out there, and it's hard to, I mean, do you have a preference? Like, if you could wave a magic wand, would you prefer to have ML engineers sort of on your team? Because maybe that would make them even more
actually
tightly coupled.
We are moving in that direction. So we have some positions that we are like hiring for, like more ML engineering type of roles, where they would really be the bridge between the technology teams and the data science teams, and yeah. So I mean, I think that's a good model in my mind, and
Great.
And actually that in some ways we could talk about career tracks and career frameworks that kind of also works out in that way. So a lot of data scientists are very interested in engineering aspects. They want to sort of know how to scale their models. They want to operate over terabytes of data or whatnot, and then there is the engineers who kind of want to move in this other direction and really understanding modeling and so on and so forth. So I think it works out both ways. So those kind of roles.
No, that's great. Well, so speaking of which, it sounds like you've done a great. Obviously, I've learned a lot on this podcast. I learned a lot about sort of how data science is playing an active role in modernizing the healthcare industry, and how you and your team are helping that through Elsevier as a company, sort of helping to make that happen. We talked a bit about bias, right, in data science, even why it's important, and some things to watch out for. And then just getting those models in production, and we're talking about the tight partnership between the engineering team and your data science teams, and roles and responsibilities, and a number of other things. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast here, Kaushik. Is there, if folks are interested in following up and having a conversation with you, can they reach out to you on LinkedIn or?
Absolutely, love to have any follow-up conversations, any feedback. I've done a few of, not a podcast, but other kinds of formats. But I love the feedback. And first of all, and thanks for having me. It was a great conversation, and I really enjoyed it myself. So
you bet. I really appreciate you coming on, and have a great rest of your week, Kaushik.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dave. Have a good week.
Thanks.